equilibrium or anything else like that. But I will tell you that on occasion I do kind of worry about getting stomped on. But it's exciting. The longer answer to the whole thing really begins with what we'll call Moon 1.0. Okay, so anyone who has been conscious for the last 48 hours probably knows that we're just working through the 45th anniversary and all the hoopla that goes along with that. And so you've learned everything about what Neil was doing every moment, Buzz was doing every moment, how many times Mike Collins saying, "Oh, Sol Mia," while he's orbiting. That isn't necessarily true. But the real question is, so how did it happen? You know, I'm not talking about 7.5 million pounds of thrust from the F1 engines. I'm not talking about Hubble's brilliant scheme approach, the lunar orbit rendezvous. I'm talking about the real fundamental things. It really comes down to politics, people, and organizations. So let's start with politics for Apollo 11. Right? It started with the Cold War and the commitment of the president to land a man on the moon. And for the United States, the launch of Sputnik and Gagarin, maybe even more so, was really kind of an existential crisis. Not an existential crisis in the sense that they're going to bomb the U.S. into Kingdom Come. Because in fact, if you look at the intelligence data, the Soviet Union only had four missiles at the time, 4 warheads. But it was an existential crisis in that for the first time in probably 50 years, the United States began to question itself as to whether or not they were really the technological leader. And I think in many ways, that's every bit as important. And we committed to this. We committed 5% of the government budget to it, and we won. But you know, as you dig into the historical archives of those events, one of the things that some historians have uncovered is that while it sounded like Kennedy was really making a commitment, he was starting to waver on the whole thing. And you actually wonder whether had he not been assassinated, whether he would have continued on. I mean, counterfactuals are kind of a slippery analytic slope, but you have to wonder whether the commitment was really there. So maybe it wasn't just an existential crisis alone that was enough. But you'll see as we talk about what's going on today, there are interesting parallels. Second part of the story, people. We've all heard the story. Average age of an engineer in Apollo was 26 years old. That's pretty amazing. Today, mid-50s. So that's 30 years older and only 45 years. We've got a problem with regenerating new people. The final piece of the puzzle is organization. And this is the dimension we really talk about least often, but in many ways, it may be the most important. And the fact was, in 1961, there really wasn't an organization. I mean, sure, there were engineering organizations, there were aerospace firms, but NASA, as a bureaucratic organization, didn't really exist. There wasn't the sort of administrative overhead. There wasn't the contractual overhead. There weren't lawyers. And that was a big part of the success. And you see this happening in any technology. You see this life cycle in any technology. That early on in a technology, there's a sort of dominance of the engineers over the administrators. And I'll give you another interesting historical data point. Largely the reason, I actually wrote my dissertation on this, the reason the Soviet Union beat us into space was that in fact, the engineers did dominate the administrators, because the administrators in the Soviet Union didn't know anything about space, didn't care about it, until after Sputnik, and then Khrushchev got the joke, right? And he was all over it. But it kind of tells you if you're going to do something really big and really new, the engineers have got to be pushing the agenda. So in '61, you know, it was a really different world. Think about this one. The Atlas rocket had a failure rate of about 40%. 40%. But these guys were courageous. You know, my dad, John Glenn, but you think they'd have looked at the slide rule every now and then. 40% failure rate, they were crazy. It was really risk on. So what does this have to do with why I'm standing here? I'm getting to that. Let's get to Moon 1.5. So 2003. President Bush announces that his vision for space exploration. We're going to return to the moon. all for the tidy sum of about $170 billion. Right? Okay, so I'm running business development in Boeing, all over human space. Life was looking pretty good for me about this time. Great times ahead. Well, funny thing happened on the way to the moon. Right, 2005, new administrator comes in, new program. We changed the program again in 2010. And right now, we're on a trajectory to launch the first spacecraft that might go around the moon in 2021. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out things are going pretty slow. So if you want to know why I got into this business and why I am in the process of metamorphosizing into a new life form, it's because this is actually where things are happening in new space. It's a remarkable period of time where I really think there is an evolutionary shift. So that brings us to Moon 2.0. So the most obvious difference between Moon 1.0 and Moon 2.0 is this time we're going with the money. Okay? If the plaque, well, the plaque did read on Apollo 11, we came in peace for all mankind. Right? This time it's going to say something along the lines, we came in profit for all our shareholders. And that's a sustainable proposition. That's a much more sustainable proposition than just going to the moon. So there's an awful lot of useful stuff on the moon. You see a bunch of things over there. You know, but near term, where the real utility is, rocket fuel. If you're going to Mars, it's going to take you something along the lines of a million kilograms of propellant to get there. At, let's call it $10,000, $15,000 a kilogram. If you can provide a service station on the moon, that's a pretty tidy business model, but that's a little bit further out in the future. So let's take a look back and go back over the things that made Apollo work, politics, people, organization. And I think there's some interesting parallels. Politics. So you could say, certainly not to the degree that Sputnik created an existential crisis, there's a real sense that we've lost leadership in civil space today. And I think it's really causing the nation to rethink a lot of what we're doing, and that creates opportunity for us. People. This is what's really important. So if you look at new space companies, I'll take my company as an example. 2/3 of the company is under 30 years old. Okay, that starts to look an awful lot like where people were at during Apollo. Now, I look out in the audience and I see this is a little bit younger crowd than what I typically see at an AIAA conference. And so I think it's very real. It's a new generation coming in here. Organization. By their very definition, new space companies are new organizational forms, right? We tend to be much more engineering heavy, or maybe I should say administratively light. At our company, we're about 90% engineers. And I suspect for all of you out there, you're probably looking at about the same ratio. That's a very important factor. Very important factor. The other aspect of it is, look, the truth is we are working with the government. Most of us out there in this business have some kind of element of government markets in the business plan. But the business plans we've got with the government are very different from those, if you call it traditional space. They tend to look like Space Act agreements. They tend to be arm's length agreements where the government is simply buying a service, it's not providing specification. As a result, the administrative overhead is a lot lower. So again, this permits the sort of technological dynamism that you didn't have in the past. Our investors are not the government. Right? Our investors are private citizens looking for a return on capital. The government has got a whole host of different motivations, and they all sit in the federal acquisition regulations. They're about that thick. So it's a very different environment. So to be sure, we're not recreating Apollo. We're doing things that are very differently. We're doing things very differently. And it's not so much that we're introducing new technologies. We're actually just taking technologies we've already got and applying them in ways that allow us to introduce order of magnitude changes. I think what's remarkable about a lot of the changes is these are things that we can do today. right? So one of the keys to making this work and making things much lower cost is we're getting small, right? So this is about 600 kilograms, fully weighed. This is about 15,000 kilograms. Now it's probably not a fair comparison looking at the MX-1 lunar lander to the lunar module, but let's just compare it to, let's say, a Discovery class science mission. We are probably at about 1/50th of the cost of what a Discovery class mission looks like. And so how do you do that? You do it by getting smaller. I'm going to talk about some of the ways that we're able to accomplish that. But first I want to talk about what being small gets you. I won't say it gets you a free ride into space, but it lets you ride as a secondary payload. So you're paying a small fraction of the cost. Instead of, let's say, $100 million per launch, you might be looking at $5 or $10 million per launch. Order of magnitude improvement by sensible application of existing technologies. Now, it's not all that easy to fly as a secondary. It's not technologically difficult. The problem is purely contractual. And it's a simple problem. Right now, with most launches, typically the payload owns the entire launch vehicle. I can get it backward. The payload, this guy, let's hit the right button. The payload, this guy, owns all the margins of the launch vehicle. If you simply let the launch vehicle own any performance margin and sell that additional capacity at a marginal cost, it allows you to do ride shares. And we've done this hundreds of times in the past. There's really no reason we can't do this today. The metaphor I like to use is, today, up to this point, most people riding as secondaries have been kind of like hitchhikers, okay? And hitchhiking, I did it when I was growing up. Kids don't do it so much these days. It's a great way to get to the beach. One of the first things you learn is it works a lot better if you have a six-pack sitting next to you. It's a great way to get to the beach, but when you become an adult, it's a lousy way to get to work. And we've got to get over that mentality. And so, as an industry, we've got to be willing to pay our fair share. We've got to be willing to accept the terms and conditions that come with riding as a secondary. But with relatively simple fixes, I think we can fundamentally change how we do space transportation. Next aspect I want to touch on how you get small is avionics. And these are just examples from what we're doing at MoonX that I think probably apply to most of you out there that are doing things in this space. Talking with Steve Jervison over lunch and looking at some of the things they're doing are very similar to what we're doing here. So avionics. This is our first iteration of our spacecraft had a traditional avionics box that looks like that, 34 kilograms. By basically taking a mixture of space-qualified components and commercial components and redundant architecture, we were able to bring that down to 6 kilograms. And not only is it the mass, but it's also the space. One of the curious ironies of space is while space is really big, volume on spacecraft tends to be the most precious commodity that there is. So this is a really important development. And again, not a huge investment, not high technology. One of the problems with these kinds of boxes that fly on traditional spacecraft is that when you're flying a $1 billion spacecraft, you want to make sure that everything that you're flying has flight history to it. Okay. If you've got flight history to something, that means it flew a long time ago, right? And so you're constantly falling further and further behind where we are in electronics technology. And what we're doing is actually using stuff that is current technology, has been tested to meet space environments fairly rigorously. And as a result, we're able to reduce cost, we're able to reduce mass, we're able to reduce volume. Next thing I want to talk about is propulsion. Propulsion is one of the real bugaboos of space. It's really, coming from ULA, I can't tell you how expensive it is. It would be embarrassing, but it's really, really expensive. It takes a really, really long time. Right now, the Air Force is trying to develop a new upper stage engine. They will spend $1 billion in 10 years developing that engine. We started an engine development program about 4 months ago. Next week, I hope, we will actually go to hot fire, 4 months. Clean sheet of paper to hot fire. Now, admittedly, we'll have bugs. We'll fire it a few times, find out we're not quite meeting specs. We'll adjust things. But I promise you, within 6 months, we will have an engine that's working. It fires really well. It's test a little, break a little, retest a little. No one does this better than I think Jeff Grayson in Sport. I'll throw in a plug for you. Okay. I mean, the guys. Sorry, John. But this is what we're doing in NewSpace that's fundamentally different from the way everyone else is working. And here's our guy, Tim Dickens. I mean, these guys are, I call them the Rocket City rednecks. Their trip. Tim's been strapping rocket engines to skateboards, bicycles, boats, jet skis. But you know what else? What? But you know what else? He also did parts of the prop system for SOS. Okay, that's pretty amazing stuff. Okay, it comes down to the people. At the end of the day. So Apollo, as I said before, had about 400,000 people. That's 400,000 people at Woodstock. Not that any of these guys were there. But it's 400,000 people. That's kind of what it looks like. Okay, this is MoonX. With the exception of that guy. He's an interloper. I don't know what's he doing in that picture. Anyway, very interesting dynamics there. I want to say a couple of words about the dynamics of our staff. These guys, this is Silicon Valley, this is Huntsville. These are the whiz kids, these are the Rocket City rednecks. One of the wonderful things about running this company is managing those two groups. And I got to tell you, sometimes there are problems with, let's call it, combustion stability. But when it works, it's pure magic. It's pure magic, and the diversity is a beautiful thing. Okay, from here I want to go into a few short charts about a little bit more. Most of what we've been talking about so far has been the NewSpace industry more broadly. A couple of words about what we're actually doing at Moon Express. So, you know, the fundamental thing, our first mission is to go to the Moon. Okay. We were going to capture the Lunar XPRIZE, and we see tremendous opportunities long-term at the Moon. You'll see, as I get into a couple of charts, there's a lot of stuff that's a lot near-term. It's probably going to make a lot more money than near-term. But let me start with what we were doing last year. We actually took our software, GNC software, plugged it into a NASA spacecraft. This is actually the Mighty Eagle at Marshall. And we flew their hovercraft, their lander, using our software. And kind of, as Bob likes to call it, we got a driver's license there. But it demonstrated we've got software and quality in the spacecraft business. Particularly, we've shown, you know, that's the toughest part of it. So we flew that sucker. It was great. This is our vehicle, the core vehicle that we're building today, that we're going to be flying very soon, the MX-1. As I said, it's about 600 kilograms, 3,700 meters per second of delta V. I told Bob the first time I saw it, that really doesn't look like a spacecraft, it looks like an upper stage. About 70% mass fraction propulsion. It actually, this is sort of the flatbed truck of it. Is it the payload deck? Nice flat place to put all your payloads. Longer term, we envision a stack where we would have what we call the MX-2, which is about 4 times the size of the MX-1, would serve in some cases as a lunar lander. And the MX-1 would then be an ascent vehicle. And then on top would be essentially a sample return capsule. The mission profile we've got for our lunar missions is 1, Google Lunar XPRIZE, 2, telescope, to the South Pole, third mission, sample return. We are very honored to have been selected for the Catalyst. Jason, I don't know if we call these awards, or they're just a selection, because you're not actually giving us any money. But what it has done, and we haven't quite finished dotting all the I's and crossing all the T's, but I got to hand it to Jason's guys. And Jason Krzan, I assume, is going to talk about this a little bit more than I am. What it allows us to do is it's a Space Act agreement that allows us to work with all NASA centers for facilities, for expertise, review, and for all of us in the industry, these kinds of agreements are a wonderful thing. I know that NASA is trying to push out a whole series of Space Act agreements, and I want to tell all of you that you ought to take advantage of this. And I also want to say that these guys have been really proactive, and I won't say they understand NewSpace entirely, but they're trying really hard. And I think I'm very happy with the progress that we've made on this. The only thing I will say is, that's probably the most tortured acronym I've ever seen. But so far I've talked about the moon, and as I said, I think there's stuff that we're going to be doing maybe before we finish the 3 missions. That's a lot more important. As I said, 70% prop mass fraction, 3,700 meters a second, fly inside an Esper ring. We're talking sort of low tens of millions of dollars per mission. There are a lot of things that we could do with NASA missions very soon. And we're talking with some principal investigators about some really interesting missions that are out there. But there are a lot of other things that you can do. This is a tug, right? It's an upper stage, a restartable, storable upper stage. It's very low cost. So one of the really interesting areas to look at is geosynchronous satellite disposal. At the end of the life of a geosynchronous satellite, they are required to go into supersynchronous orbit, and they have to burn their last few months of precious propellant to go out into a supersynchronous orbit. Well, these things are generating $10, $15 million a month. If we can get them out, if we can allow them to essentially burn all of their fuel and take them out to a supersynchronous orbit disposal, that's a mission's worth real money. And there's real value that can be unlocked there. Other missions that we would be looking at would be spacecraft deployment. Put lots of spacecraft, smaller spacecraft on this deck, and you can go deploy them in slightly different orbits. Remember, we've got 3,700 meters a second. We can put lots of things in different places where people might not necessarily see you are putting them because you're flying inside an Esper ring. There are certain parts of the U.S. government that might find that to be a very attractive mission. Lots of stuff that you can do with a little truck in space. One of the things that we learned, maybe the hard way a little bit, is when we started out, we were going to buy everything. We're buying our engines from Rocketdyne, buying our avionics from traditional avionics suppliers. And we found out a couple of things. One, it's expensive. 2, it doesn't meet schedule. 3, it tends not to meet the performance specs that we need. So what we've done is we're insourcing a huge part of our spacecraft. I told you we're building our prop system, avionics, and this has fundamentally changed our ability to build the kind of spacecraft we need to accomplish our missions. We kind of follow the bouncing meatball in our location. So we've got our headquarters at Ames, which is a great place to have your headquarters, right? Pete Worden has really started, in many ways, the small sat revolution. This valley is where you want to get your avionics. This valley is where you want to get your software people. It's a great place to have your headquarters. But if you're talking propulsion, right, you want to be in Alabama. You want to be in Huntsville, Alabama. You want to be next to Marshall. So Tim Pickens and his team are down there. When you start looking at testing operations, testing engines, hover tests, you want to be in Florida. And so we're talking to Space Florida and the folks at Cape about bringing some operations there. So we're not just a Silicon Valley firm, we're going nationwide. Okay? So I think that's all I've got for you today. But, the first time Moon 1.0, we went there, we jumped around, we waved. We came home. If you're doing real commerce, you're going to stay there. And so that's what I have for you today. I'm happy to take some questions. I'm sure I'll have some money on the table at the time. No questions? Yes, sir.
I'm wondering if you would be willing to venture some rough estimate as to the cost of the satellite disposal.
Yeah, I would, but it'd be in private.
I understand.
Yeah, I mean, but you've got a sense. I mean, it would be a mission, right? And I haven't
Found it already, I understand.
Okay. Back there, your hand's up higher than anyone else.
Yeah.
Sure.
So you talked a lot about the technical side and the people side and all that. What about the financial side of that? And what part of the time and effort is going into trying to raise the money to go do this versus the technology versus the team?
Yeah, the question was, so I talked about technology, I talked about people, that's all great. What about money? That's his job. That's Bob's job, and Bob spends a big chunk of every day doing that. And we've raised a pretty sizable percentage. When we're building hardware, we're going to be flying hover tests this year. And we're not. This isn't paper. This is real hardware.
Yes, is that 40 million? I think you said 40 million.
I didn't say 40.
You said you gave some
Oh.
mission cost.
I gave a number which I said tens of millions, probably low tens of millions.
Okay, well,
You're not going to pin me down to a number like that. Nice try.
I was curious if that included launch costs.
I'm sorry?
I was curious if that included launch costs.
Yeah.
And what vehicle that assumed.
Doesn't matter. I mean, that's if we fly inside an Esper ring. An Esper ring is designed to fit the standard interfaces for a ComSat, so we can fly on any launch vehicle. And we're talking to them all.
But the mission price will depend on which one you fly, right?
I beg your pardon?
The mission price will depend on which one you fly on.
Yeah. But I mean, so right now it is a really undeveloped market. You've got some people trying to get a lot of money, some people saying, you know what, I'm just happy to fly you because I think you guys are cool, believe it or not. It will stabilize over time once the market starts to develop. And you know, as I said, we're going from hitchhiking to buying plane tickets. And nobody really, I can tell you what the marginal costs are, they're trivial. The cost of the additional integration costs that you've got to do to fly it, the cost of an Esper ring aren't high. But you know, the bottom line is the guy who's sitting on top wants to get something out of the deal. So if I'm a launch provider, which I used to be, right? I would like that secondary guy to pay some money so I can drop my price to the primary guy so I can become more competitive. That's the business model that's going to make this work. Now, and like I said, the numbers are kind of all over the place and we're shopping it around.
But are launch costs a significant driver or not? Because that's what I'm trying to figure out.
Well, it depends. There are some people that are charging a huge amount where the launch cost could be a significant driver. I'll tell you where I think we end up on this is launch costs would be, yeah. All my degrees are political science and policy, right? No, I'd say probably 10 to 20%. So it's going to be as a fraction of our total cost, less than what you see for a typical traditional mission. Is that it? Great, I think there's a simple question on top of you, right?
Thank you very much, Andy, and we're glad that you've made it to this side of the industry. Maybe a little crazier side of the industry, but that's good.
It may be the most important. And the fact was, in 1961, there really wasn't an organization. I'm sure there were engineering organizations, there were aerospace firms, But NASA, as a bureaucratic organization, didn't really exist. There wasn't the sort of administrative overhead. There wasn't the contractual overhead. There weren't lawyers. And that was a big part of the success. And you see this happening in any technology. It took me a while to get that. You see this life cycle in any technology. That early on in a technology, there's a sort of dominance of the engineers over the administrators. And I'll give you another interesting historical data point. Largely, the 7.5 million pounds of thrust from the F-1 engines, I'm not talking about Hubble's brilliant scheme approach, the Lunar orbit rendezvous. I'm talking about the real fundamental things. It really comes down to politics, people, and organizations. So let's start with politics for Apollo 11. Right? It started with the Cold War and the commitment of a president to land a man on the moon. And for the United States, the launch of Sputnik and Gagarin, maybe even more so, was really kind of an existential crisis. Not an existential crisis in the sense that they're going to bomb the U.S. into Kingdom Come. Because in fact, if you look at the intelligence data, the Soviet Union only had four missiles at the time, 4 warheads. But it was an existential crisis in that for the first time in probably 50 years, the United States began to question itself as to whether or not they were really the technological leaders. And I think in many ways, that's every bit as important. And we committed to it. We committed 5% of the government budget to it, and we won. But you know, as you dig into the historical archives of those events, one of the things that some historians have uncovered is that while it sounded like Kennedy was really making a commitment, he was starting to waver on the whole thing. And you actually wonder whether had he not been assassinated, equilibrium or anything else like that. But I will tell you that on occasion I do kind of worry about getting stomped on. But it's exciting. The longer answer to the whole thing really begins with what we'll call Moon 1.0. Okay, so anyone who has been conscious for the last 48 hours probably knows that we're just working through the 35th anniversary and all the hoopla that goes along with that. And so you've learned everything about what Neil was doing every moment, Buzz was doing every moment, how many times Mike Collins saying, "Oh, Sole Mia," while he's orbiting. That isn't necessarily true. But the real question is, so how did it happen? You know, I'm not talking about whether we would have continued on. I mean, counterfactuals are kind of a slippery analytic slope, but you have to wonder whether the commitment was really there. So maybe it wasn't just an existential crisis alone that was enough. But you'll see as we talk about what's going on today, there are interesting parallels. Second part of the story is people. We've all heard this story. Average age of an engineer in Apollo was 26. 26 years old. That's pretty amazing. Today, mid-50s. So that's 30 years older and only 45 years. We've got a problem with regenerating new people. The final piece of the puzzle is organization. And this is the dimension we really talk about least often, but in many ways,